Welcome to Poetry of Immigrants. Today our show is called Humanitarian Crisis, Suffering and Hope on the Southern Border. Our guests today are Chris Van Scoy, Robin Baslaw, Deb Cohen, and myself, Gemma Mathewson. And I'd like to thank Frank Crowley, who is the producer of the show, and also the whole cast here, all the people who help us at Valley Shore Community Television. I'd like to read a brief introduction about our show. Our presentation is about the time that we spent at the southern border in Tucson, Arizona. There were 10 of us that went, and we have been involved with the immigration rights and safety issues here in Connecticut as well as before we left. Before the trip, we barely knew one another. We had a fluent Spanish speaker, people with medical backgrounds, a poet, an ordained minister, scientists, social worker, teachers, and a journalist. We shared meals together. We prayed in English, Spanish, and Hebrew together. We laughed and cried together. But most importantly, we opened our hearts and we listened. We started in Nogales, Mexico, a city of hope and broken dreams. People wait there until their number is called to cross the border to seek asylum. And people are left there when their pursuit of safety and liberty is denied. We spent 3 days in the desert with volunteers who have spent the past 14 years providing humanitarian aid to immigrants crossing the desert. We joined them in their work and heard about their encounters with immigrants, border patrol, militia, and sadly, human remains. We spent time with artists that devote their life's work to preserving the stories of faith, suffering, and hope. In Tucson, we went to the federal courthouse to witness Operation Streamline, where immigrants are quickly processed to be sent back to their country of origin. We spent 3 days at the monastery shelter, where immigrant families are dropped off by Border Patrol before going to their new homes in the United States to pursue their next phase in seeking asylum. There we worked alongside hundreds of other volunteers. Guests leave within 48 hours for the next phase of their journey. We hope and pray that their dreams for the safety of their families and for their children going to schools and for the opportunity to make a meaningful contribution are realized. We know, however, that most will be sent back. Here in Connecticut, one of the best states for immigrants, 76% of immigrants seeking asylum are sent back. In Arizona, it is 93% who are denied asylum. You will note that unless taken from published websites, none of the photos in our presentation will show faces of immigrants. We wish we could show you the faces of the people that have so touched our hearts, but they have grave safety concerns for their families and who have yet to make it across the border to safety. We heard stories from the asylum seekers, humanitarian aid workers, artists, and lawyers, all about efforts to escape violence and persecution and the dangers faced by those making the journey from their homelands to the United States. These struggles and acts of bravery have been played out for centuries by all the immigrants who have come before them. What distinguishes this struggle is the opportunities they present for us today. And so 4 of us from that trip will present the slides and talk about different aspects of our journey. Okay, first slide, please.
So there are 2 ways that people can enter the country. One is to risk a desert crossing, which I will talk about, and then is through asylum seeking. So as you can see, it's a beautiful desert. However, not much shade, and there's no access to water. In the summer, it can go like to 120 degrees. In the winter, it actually can go below freezing. So through either heat exhaustion, hypothermia, or just having no liquid. The death rate is fairly significant. Next slides, please. So again, we just started out and we're walking up in the distance on the slide on the right. I don't know how clear, and Deb will talk about it more, but there's surveillance all over the place. So in addition to Border Patrol, there's a lot of surveillance. Next slide, please. So starting in 2001, people started risking the desert crossing because a lot of the ports of entry became closed. So Tucson, Arizona became one of those places in that area. And fairly quickly, it was obvious that people were dying in trying to make the crossing. And a group of Samaritans, both in Green Valley and Tucson, started, so they've been doing it for 14 years, going through the roads, dropping off water, providing humanitarian aid in the way of first aid. There's some food, just checking on people. They can't give them rides, but they can just check to see on their general health. Most of the Samaritans that we met with, and we spent 3 days in the desert, are retired folks, some of whom just came to spend their golden years and realized they're not going to spend it playing golf, they're going to be doing something. Next slide, please. Oh, so Paul's actually showing us one of the surveillance places in that shot. Just the vastness of it, and it's so, in addition to everything else, it's so easy to get lost. There's no markers along the way. So what people end up doing, for the most part, is hiring coyotes who are part of the cartel. They give their life savings to help them with this crossing. And if you don't keep up, like a thing like a blister can kill you, because the cartel, they're moving you along. They're going to get their money when they make the drop along the road where someone's going to pick these people up. So sometimes people who've been in this country for a while, then they want to have their kids brought over. And the first, actually, and I'm going to talk about it in a minute, the first site that we saw of human remains that was marked was of an 18-month-old child. Next slide, please. So these are water drops that are provided. These are one of the humanitarian aid groups, and there's a blue flag so migrants know that it's there. And then we went to make sure that everything was in good shape. There are militia groups, vigilante groups that will go and hack off the spigot so people don't have access to that water. So that's constantly being checked. Next slide, please. Along the way in desert, another way that surveillance is done is occasionally there are helicopters that fly over and people just scatter. In this case, this was a backpack of a child. You could see that. We don't know what happened with her, but that was one of the things that we found while we were in the desert. Next slide, please. One of the men that we spent a day with is an artist, Alvaro Encisco. He believes strongly that a place where a human being has died is a sacred place, and he plants crosses along with volunteers for places where they found human remains. What happens when human remains are found, it's reported to the medical examiner's office, the GPS markings are there, and every week Alvaro goes out and he plants crosses. So far, since 2001, they've recorded over 3,000 deaths. Alvaro has planted about 900, thank you, 900 crosses. I have a smaller version of one of the crosses if you want to show it. And on every single cross, there's a red dot, and we all are also wearing these red dots. You can see it. And the red dot marks this is a place where a person has died, and the back part of it is the GPS markings. I think I'd like to introduce a poem now, if that's okay.
Sure, absolutely.
So, Gemma mentioned that the journey from an unsafe place to get to a safe place is not a new thing. This has been going on forever. Many people have risked their lives to make this journey. This poem actually is from a former Yiddish teacher of mine. Her name is a poet. Her name is Irena Klepwitz. She herself was born in a DP camp in Poland. And the name of this poem is called Litops, which means living stone in Polish. Barely differentiated from the inorganic, they conceal their passions in sheer survival. It is philosophy, life's hard growth and erosion. Even rocks, in the end, are broken down to formless dust. But like all schema, incomplete, for between the gray and fleshy crevices, strange blossoms grow in brazen colors. For us, it is the ancient sign that every life has its secret longings to transcend the daily pressing need, longings that one day must flower.
That was beautiful, thank you.
The next slide, please. So the day we went out with Alvaro, we planted 2 crosses, one for a man and one for a woman. After planting the crosses, we said a prayer. Actually, we said 3 prayers. In the center slide, we're saying the Kaddish, a Hebrew prayer for mourning. In back of us was a monk, and he led us in prayer in Spanish. And in the slide to the right, a person who came with us also, who was a minister, led us in another prayer. Oftentimes, most often, you don't know who the person is. We know if it's male or female, but we don't know who it is. We don't know the name. They do send the DNA back, and hopefully someday families will find out what happened. But this represents to Alvaro the death of the American dream. People make this crossing in belief that it's going to be for safety and for a good life. And this is how it ends. Next slide, please. So I want to get this right. It's a 262-mile border. Every one of those dots, every one of over 3,000 red dots represents a death. They call this the death map. Next slide, please. And here we are at Alvaro's studio, and actually the cross I just showed you, Chris is holding. Next slide, please. Okay, Deb.
So I'm going to share just a little bit of information about the kind of surveillance techniques that are used by Border Patrol. Most folks who pick up a paper every day are aware of the wall, but there are many more things that are being used outside, out in the desert, away from the border specifically. This picture is of a surveillance tower. This tower has camera equipment at the top. It is able to see for miles around and then shoot out the information that it has about movement in the desert to Border Patrol agents who are stationed throughout the area in trucks. We also learned, if you'll recall a few slides back where there was the 50-gallon blue drum with water, we also learned that in those areas, Border Patrol uses ground sensors so that they can hear and pick up footsteps and movement. And they can pick up the movement of many people at a time, and again, that information gets sent out to agents who are ready to pick folks up. Next slide, please. Border Patrol is everywhere throughout the desert. A seemingly innocent-looking white truck actually holds an agent who is sitting in waiting for people who are trying to cross the desert. The folks who are crossing the desert are not doing this by choice, and they're not doing it under ideal conditions. They may be wandering after days of having no water, wandering after days of no food, of being disoriented, and the patrol agents are basically waiting to pick them up. I do want to share a very short excuse me, story that we heard from one of the Samaritans with whom we traveled. And not only do the immigrants who are crossing the desert cross with very few material supports, they also very often come without information supports. And the Samaritan that was telling us this story was relating how he came upon an immigrant on one particular day, and he stopped and he offered him water and he offered him food, and he took care of those needs. And then he asked him, "Is there anything else that I can help you with?" And the answer from this very unfortunate man was, "Yes, only one thing. Could you please point me in the direction of New York City?" And I tell that story as an illustration of how not only desperate but very often innocent these folks are. All they can think of is that they're going to cross the desert and they're going to reach a better life, not knowing the conditions that they're going to face. Next slide, please. And then throughout many of the roads on the American side of the border, there are checkpoints. And this is a checkpoint that we had to pass through when we were traveling between Tucson and Arivaca. It took all of 2 seconds for us to go through this checkpoint. There were 8 of us in the car, and we like to describe ourselves on that particular day as a group of 8 white women, most of us gray-haired, and obviously not posing any threat. So when we went through this checkpoint, there were no problems, and again, it took a couple of seconds. It's not always the case. For folks who don't look like us, it's quite another experience. Next slide, please. Okay. Before going on to this slide, there is a poem that I would like to offer as well. And it speaks to the experience of all of those who are crossing the desert, again, with no material support and no informational support. When we were in the desert, particularly on the day that we went with Alvaro to plant the crosses, I was suddenly overwhelmed with the understanding that I was walking on sacred ground, I was walking on death ground, I was walking across ground that held untold numbers of people who died on the journey, who didn't make it. Many of them forgotten, many of them will never be recognized, their remains will not be found. And so these words came to me on that afternoon. Hermano, what were you thinking? I walked some of your path today, but did not see you. I walked some of your path today and planted crosses at 2 death places. Was one of them yours? I'll not see you in this lifetime, but I long to know. What were you thinking when you set out on your journey toward the dream of a better life? What were you thinking when you left your loved ones behind with the dream of reunion in a better place? What were you thinking when you first laid eyes on the desert that would try you until your final moments? What were you thinking when you had to stop? Was it illness? Was it injury? Was it heat? Was it cold? Was it hunger? Was it despair? What were you thinking? What were you thinking when you knew you had to stop? What were you thinking when you realized you would not be able to continue? What were you thinking when you watched as the others went on their way without you? What were you thinking in those first moments of being alone? What were you thinking when you knew you were going to die? What were you thinking? The truth of the matter is that there are probably thousands more who are out in the desert who will never be recognized. And that was written for those folks. Okay, now we can go to that next slide. I think back one, please. Thank you. The very first day that we were in Arizona, we actually made the trip down to Nogales on the Mexican side of the border. This slide is the picture of a memorial to a young man named Jose Antonio Elena Rodriguez, who on October 10th, 2012, at the age of 16, was shot and killed by a Border Patrol agent on the American side of the wall. The wall is visible in the picture on the right side of this slide. Border Patrol were called to this particular area of the wall at the report of two men who were trying to climb it, and they went to investigate that. As the two men were climbing back down, apparently, as the story goes, there were people on the Mexican side who began to throw rocks at the wall. Imagine that the people who were throwing the rocks were on the road. Above the road is that rock encroachment upon which the border wall is built, and that portion of the border wall is at least 18 feet high. Border Patrol agent named Lonnie Schwartz decided that he felt his life was endangered by rocks being thrown at the wall. He pointed his rifle through the slats in the wall and shot Jose 12 times. Jose was shot twice in the back of the head, 10 times in the back. It has actually never been fully established that Jose was one of the folks who were throwing the rocks, but one way or the other, the might of Border Patrol was in evidence that day, and that Border Patrol agent has been held totally innocent of any charges that were brought against him. He walks free, Jose is dead. Next slide, please. And this is a shot of the wall covered in many rows of concertina wire. You may be surprised to know that this is the American side of the wall. The reason for the concertina wire being there is to deter people from climbing up on the Mexican side and then dropping over onto the American side. And this goes for miles and miles and miles. Next slide, please. Okay, Chris, I believe you're up.
Okay. This is a photograph taken outside of El Comedor, which is Spanish for dining room. It is a food shelter where asylum seekers who are waiting on the Mexican side can get a meal, or what happens is if someone is being deported back to Mexico, the Homeland Security people fill up a bus, drive it onto the Mexican side of Nogales, and let them out, and they're just dropped off, no money.
Excuse me, Chris, we're going to be making a transition for the break, and you'll have all the time you need in the second half to continue.
Oh, okay.
Okay?
All right.
We'll be taking the break
I didn't
right
know
now.
that.
Yeah, thank you.
Sorry.
No, don't be sorry.
Take a look at the people you'll meet today. It might just be for a moment, but the difference you could make in their lives can last a lifetime. If you could save one person, who would you save?
Calls me googly eyes.
You know you're beautiful, right? You know that?
Even you are beautiful. I got bullied for wearing glasses. Share if you're against bullying.
We put it out there, just took off. 3 million people have shared this post. Don't let bullies get you down. I stand with you. Our whole family's wearing glasses. I wear glasses and I'm proud.
I even have the army on my team.
All the kind comments brought my child joy. I don't feel thank you is enough.
Next.
On page 4 that the projections need to be blood next Thursday.
Seriously? Thursday? Can't do that.
This is really inconvenient.
I have yoga that day. I have no time for this. So
I can't do Thursday, but I can do Friday.
Disasters don't plan ahead. You can. Talk to your loved ones about how you're going to be ready in an emergency. Don't wait. Communicate.
Patriotism. It inspires passionate debate. It's worn like a badge of honor with good reason, because it means love and devotion for one's country. But what really makes up this country of ours? It's the people. To love America is to love all Americans. This year, patriotism shouldn't just be about pride of country. It should be about love. Love beyond age, sexuality, disability, race, religion, and other labels. Because love has no labels.
We adopted Christopher when he was about 8 years old.
How are you doing today?
He's really an outstanding young man.
Presto.
Christopher just fits. He's part of our family.
So what are you going to do this weekend?
Goodwill has given him the opportunity to blossom.
We're very proud of him. We can't imagine our life without him.
We're back, and Chris Van Scoy is going to talk about another part of our journey on the southern border.
Slide, please. This is outside of El Comedor, which is a soup kitchen where asylum seekers who are in Mexico were waiting to pass their credible fear interview so they can then enter the United States. But it's also where people who've been deported into Mexico go to get a meal, because the Homeland Security bus just drops them off on the Mexican side. They have no money. All they have is the clothes on their back. But they're supposed to be able to get to wherever they live in Mexico with no nourishment, no water. This is Robin, who is reading a book which is in Spanish, to the children there. We were advised to bring toys and gifts to give to the children when we go to the shelters. So she happened to have a book, and there was that one little boy that's in the background there with a hat on, sitting all by himself. She sat down with him, started reading him a story. Then the little girl came and sat next to him and was listening to the story, and before you know it, there was a gang of kids sitting there listening to the story. They're kids. They're not dangerous. They're children whose parents brought them here for a better life. Next slide, please. This is inside El Comedor. As you can see, the people that are sitting there are praying. They are probably praying that they're glad they're there alive, that they're going to be near their family again. This dining area is managed by the Kino Border Initiative, which is a faith-based binational group which provides services for immigrants. And this is part of their program, feeding the people. They also provide some legal services, first aid. If someone is in really bad shape, they'll drive them to a doctor or to a clinic. They also provide some shoes, clothing if the people need it, and there's restrooms there they can wash up in. Next slide. This is Paco,
Pancho,
affectionately called Panchito, and he he's Mexican born, moved to Phoenix 44 years ago, worked in Phoenix for 33 years as a nurse's aide. 10 years ago, he was deported back to Mexico. So what he decided to do was he converted this old van into an ambulance, and this is now on the Mexican side. He drives around to all the shelters where the people are waiting to cross the border, provides first aid. Well, if someone's in bad shape, he'll drive them to the doctors or the hospital. He does not get paid for this. He will park his van out in a visible spot on the side of the road, and people just line up behind him to seek some help with the problem. The woman with the blue shirt in the background was an APRN from New York State who was spending her week of vacation driving around with him, helping him with caring for the poor and the needy. And he, when asked why he does this, he said, "I do it because my Christian faith tells me to do that." Next slide. This is him doing some doctoring. Well, not doctoring, some first aid, looking in a woman's mouth. Next slide. Okay, this is one of the shelters on the Mexican side. It's called La Roca, which is the rock. And it's called that because it sits on top of this huge, huge rock on the side of the road. Next slide. Here's the steepness of it. It is literally, it's a good 50 to 75 feet above the ground. You have to climb stairs to get to it. This is also managed by a faith group of 7 churches. Next slide. This is the roof off of the women's dormitory. And this is where the people wash their own clothes by hand and lay their clothing out on this roof to dry. In the distance, you can see the the wall right across the street. So they're in this shelter waiting and waiting and waiting for the number to be called. And there's the USA right there. This roof was maybe 50 feet off the ground, and the children used to play on this roof because it was the only flat area on this property. And then one of the cartels there in Nogales told them that no children are going to be allowed to play outside, so the children aren't even allowed to play out on the roof anymore. Next slide.
This is a picture of the very first shelter that we visited. And am I online? Okay. This is really like a storefront, minus any windows, if you don't count the door. The woman who brought us to this shelter and who actually was a wonderful guide for our entire day in Nogales is Shura Wallen. Shura has been doing this work for probably 15 years. So she brought us to this shelter. Inside this windowless room were mattresses on the floor, plastic bags holding what few belongings the families might have been able to bring with them. There were moms and dads and children. And when we walked in, I was prepared to see people really looking solemn and looking afraid. And what I found instead were people who looked hopeful, people who had a sense of hope and their eyes on the prize of actually getting to the United States in hopes of reaching that better life. It was a powerful experience.
So part of the reason for that was that by the time they get to that place, they're going to be going across the border within a time 48 hours, whereas the people in El Roca, they can be there for months.
Right.
So that's an important piece. That storefront is located across the street from the border crossing.
Thank you for that reminder. The people who do reach this particular shelter have been given numbers when they get to Nogales. People are told that it could be a very, very long time before their number is called by Border Patrol on the American side of the border. So it could be days or weeks or months before their number is called, and many people who realize that it could be months before their number is called to come through with documentation through official points of entry make the decision to take their chances and cross the desert instead, unfortunately. Next slide. The people whose numbers are called, who do come and speak with Border Patrol and tell their story and are deemed to have a credible fear claim, that there's a possibility that they might be granted asylum, and who have family members scattered throughout the United States who will act as their sponsor, are then transported from that place at the border to shelters. In this particular one, it's to a monastery shelter in Tucson, where their experience will get them ready to travel on to their sponsor families. Next slide, please.
Okay, this is the Benedictine Monastery in Tucson. It was the home of the Benedictine monks, and it has passed to the hands of a developer who purchased it to develop apartments and condos in the city of Tucson. When it became necessary for the group called Casa Alitas, which means the House of Wings, which is a group of faith-based community volunteers to house immigrants coming into the country. When the need became great, when the numbers reached about 200 people, they needed a bigger place to house all the people who would be going through the process. So they, this man stepped forward and said between January and I think March, he would allow the Benedictine monastery to be used for that. But then it was January through May. Now it's January through June. Right now, he thinks in July, this place will no longer be available. But we did go there for 3 days. Please, next slide. We did go there for 3 days, and you can see this is the inside of the monastery where beds, cots have been set up for the people there. While we were there for 3 days, helping the volunteers for the people with refugee status who were able to come that far in their process. There were, I think, 250 people, was it?
Yeah, they didn't have refugee status, though. That's it's important.
That's their first. It's their first step in establishing.
Asylum seeking.
Yes, and asylum seeking status. So it's only their first step. But from here, they have about 48 hours. Through which time there's an interview process to find where they, who has become their sponsor, and they're sent to different parts of the country, either by bus or by airplane. Okay, next slide, please. This is Melinda Tuhus. She's a member of our group of 10 who speaks Spanish, and she did the intake interviews for families who are coming to that monastery for their temporary stay. She found out many stories of the people who came. Most of the people who arrived at the monastery at that time from the Homeland Security bus were coming from Guatemala. They had been under a bridge in Texas.
El Paso.
Yeah, El Paso, Texas. And they arrived here, and they would be going to different places from there to places in the country. Next slide, please. Okay, this is our Chris, and she's talking with RNRN, which is an organization of nurses who volunteer their time to be sent to different places where they're needed. And they are relieving the Tucson volunteer nurses so that they can be with their families on a Sunday. The things that are provided at this shelter, the monastery, were food, shelter, clothing, and medical care. When they arrive, often they need, the asylum seekers need medical care. And the slide on the right shows you a chart of identifying body parts for people that speak different languages from Central America. There are 80 different languages that people may not have Spanish as their first language. It may be a different language, and they need to be able to express what's wrong with them or where they might need help. Next slide, please. So again, the necessities are provided for them. Food is donated. There are people who come and volunteer to cook the food and serve the food, and the person on the right is while the people are there, the people who are seeking their refugee status, people coming there will ask to pick up a broom or to cook or to work in the laundry, to wash clothes, because they need to feel like they are, a part of the functioning community that they, find themselves in. And the dignity of work is important for all human beings, and that's what they are assuming for themselves here. Next slide, please. Okay, this is La Ropa, which is a little room, big room, where donated clothing is people who have, everybody who arrives, literally many people arrive with just the shirts on their backs, just the clothes that they're wearing. One of the big needs at the time we were there are jeans for men and boys and underwear for women. And as mundane as that sounds, that shows you the reality of how and what dire need people are when they get there. So we help them by going out and buying some of the things that they needed at the time.
People are also going to climates that they're unfamiliar with.
Good point.
So they're coming from a warm climate and then they're being shipped off to Wisconsin. So,
yeah. Okay, next slide, please. Okay, so Robin and I both work with the children. There's a children's room and places outside for children to play. Again, I talked about food, shelter, and clothing and the dignity of work, but children need play. And the children, whether they came tired, exhausted, maybe with a little cold, whatever, they wanted to play. They were not shy, most of them, about playing with other children, blowing bubbles, popping bubbles, and working with clay and so on. Next slide, please. Okay, this is a drawing a child did. I'd like to, at this point, read a poem that I wrote, which follows a little girl that we met there and her father. And I will read the poem, and afterwards I will talk about what some of the references are. This is called Jimena's Story. We came from a place that was once beautiful, Poppy whispers to me in the dark, where we shiver under a crinkly silver sheet below the bridge. I remember only dried up plants and hard dirt around our house, but with my eyes closed, he helps me to see the bright colored bird in the clouds, flying over fruit trees, swaying in the breeze on hillsides, above and between a river filled with fish, butterflies, flowers. But all of home is gone now. Poppy wraps me in the bundle of his arms to warm me, so that when we wake, I am not sick like he and some of the other travelers are. We wait in line a long time, and some ladies give us pipe cleaners and show us how to make them into dolls. Then we are on a bus that goes on forever across the desert, and Poppy's eyes are bright. But we don't cry for Mommy and Hermanito anymore, because he will send for them when we are in a place in USA called Chattanooga, where I also have cousins. At last the bus brings us to a very big church where many buses of people are resting and eating and praying and washing and playing and sleeping and talking to people at desks. Poppy and I follow people into a big room with long tables, and a lady tells us to breathe in and breathe out and know that we are guests here and know that we are safe here. We are breathing in and out one big breath together, and it sounds like a big hug. And soon we line up to get chicken soup. And I like the kind with potatoes, but not the kind with broccoli. We are so tired, and everything happens like in a dream. We sleep on cots right in the church, and we eat again, and we go to a room where Poppy sits on the floor with another man, while I play with some soft animal toys. We are taken into another room where ladies help Poppy find a new hat and a jacket. And one finds me a fancy pink coat with petals like a flower, and I don't take it off, not even when we go to sleep again. Later, I go back to the toy room where I make clay animals with other children and make a picture of a flower and ask the teacher to put it on the wall and with many other children's pictures. And she lets me choose just the right spot. Then we go outside and she blows bubbles and we take turns and we chase them to the ground, and I see bigger children riding scooters and bikes. When we wake again, a man takes us to the airport to find the plane to Chattanooga, and some ladies from the big church are there too. And they help us ride moving paths and stairs to the plane, but we need to wait some more. So we draw pictures with crayons and paper, and Poppy even draws a funny pig. And another lady will let us on the plane when it is ready, buys us hamburgers. Poppy's eyes are sleepy when we get on the plane and we go up to the sky to find our new home, like birds flying in the clouds. Next slide, please. And this is just a picture of some of the things that the children have left behind at the monastery when they're traveling. Next slide, please. And this is a picture of what Robin did and some of the other people did to get people prepared for their journeys, that they'll be on a plane or on a bus for 2 or 3 days. Robin's packing up supplies for formula and snacks and sandwiches for people to take with them. Next slide, please. And this shows the little girl. You can see her with a little flower petal jacket. She was a real child who really was with us, and you can see the man on the way right is the man that helped them, another volunteer from the monastery who brings people to the airport and gets them to bus stations, and we did help that family. That man and his daughter traveled together, even though they have more of their family back home in Guatemala. Even though there is no longer officially a family separation, a child from parents, if 2 parents come, what Homeland Security will do is they will separate a father from the rest of the family if they all come intact sometimes. That is one of the things that they are still doing. But that father and that daughter have arrived in Chattanooga to be with part of their family, but the mother and the son remain behind. Another thing to remember is that the chances of that father remaining in the country after his interviews with ICE is less than 25%, about 23% all around. Another thing to remember is that the whole experience at Casa Elite, at the monastery, that will be gone in June, and these people will have to find another place to be housed for the time before they're sent out into the sponsoring families. And it is the way our government is now. No money is being given to house and sponsor these families. It is up to humanitarian aid groups to do that right now. They are picking up the slack that our government is not supplying. I do want to make sure that...
She has her poem.
Oh, okay. We have time for a poem. I do want to make sure that I mention that.
Okay.
I'm sorry. Go ahead, Chris.
That's
Chris,
all right.
You have a poem too.
A lot of people ask the question, well, why do they leave home? And this is a poem that addresses that. Home by Warsan Shire. No one leaves home unless home is the mouth of a shark. You only run for the border when you see the whole city running as well. Your neighbors running faster than you, breath bloody in the throats, the boy you went to school with who kissed you dizzy behind the old tin factory. He's holding a gun bigger than his body. You only leave home when home won't let you stay. No one leaves home unless home chases you fire under feet. hot blood in your belly. It's not something you ever thought of doing until the blade burnt threats into your neck. And even then you call the anthem under your breath, only tearing up your passport in an airport toilet, sobbing as each mouthful of paper made it clear that you wouldn't be going back. You have to understand that no one puts children in a boat unless the water is safer than the land. Mm-hmm. No one burns their palms under trains beneath carriages. No one spends days and nights in the stomach of a truck feeding on newspaper unless the miles traveled means something more than journey. No one crawls under fences. No one wants to be beaten, pitied. No one chooses refugee camps or strip searches where your body is left aching, or prison because prison is safer than a city of life. And one prison guard in the night is better than a truckload of men who look like your father. No one could take it. No one could stomach it. No one's skin would be tough enough. Go home, blacks. Go home, refugees, dirty immigrants, asylum seekers, sucking our country dry. Niggers with their hands out, they smell strange, savage. Messed up their country and now they want to mess ours up. How do the words, the dirty looks, roll off your backs? Maybe because the blow is softer than a limb torn off. Or the words are more tender than 14 men between your legs. Or the insults are easier to swallow than rubble, than bone, than your child body in pieces. I want to go home, but home is the mouth of a shark. Home is the barrel of the gun. And no one would leave home unless home chased you to the shore. Unless home told you to quicken your legs, leave your clothes behind, crawl through the desert, wade through the oceans, drown, save, be hunger, beg, forget pride. Your survival is more important. No one leaves home until home is a sweaty voice saying, leave. Run away from me now. I don't know what I've become, but I know that anywhere is safer than here.
Thank you very much. I'm glad that you reminded me to have Chris read that. That is... So what I would like to make sure that we do is mention, if any of this touches you or any of this makes you feel like you should or would like to become involved in any way, there are actions and humanitarian work we can do right here in Connecticut, and I want to leave you with a few contacts you can make. One is Connecticut Shoreline Indivisible, and the email is Ginny King Jr. So it's GINIKINGJR@gmail.com. That's for Connecticut Shoreline Indivisible. For Unidad Latina en Acción, it is ULACCION@yahoo.com. And if you'd like to contact through this station, I'm Gemma Mathewson. You could contact me and I can refer you to many different support groups. And my email address is gemop@comcast.net. Thank you very much for having us here today. Thank you to Chris and to Robin and to Deborah. And thank you to all the staff at Valley Shore TV and to Frank, our co-host.
If I may very quickly say, or just remind everybody here in Connecticut that these horrors are not just happening at the border. We have many of our residents here in Connecticut under the threat of deportation, some of them seeking sanctuary in churches. We are in the thick of it here, and we need as many allies as possible to do the work with us. So come, join us, please.
Thanks.